Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the Illinois State Water Survey at the U of I, and today this webinar is entitled What Environmental Health Professionals Need to Know About Wells. It's part of a series. We do monthly webinars for either environmental health professionals, sometimes realtors or labs, as well as for well owners themselves. And today this webinar is meant for environmental health professionals. We know from the questions that we received in advance that a number of well owners are also registered and have posted questions. There are other webinars for you folks as well. I'm sure there's things you'll learn today, but just be aware that really we're gearing this towards those local and county and state health department folks that are out there to serve well owners and help them with their issues. Okay, so moving on. Everybody heard that, I assume. Quickly, so these webinars are all, we're affiliated with NEHA and they're a partner on our grant through RCAP and the National Environmental Health Association. So this webinar is worth CEUs through NEHA. And I know in the handouts tab on your GoToWebinar screen, if you click on that, there's 4 handouts listed there, or 5 maybe, I think there's 4, that are all forms that you'd need for getting your CEUs. And NEHA is on a 2-year credentialing cycle, and so I used as an example here, if your credentialing cycle ends on 6/30/18 and you took this today, you'd be able to take the similar webinar again after 7/1, but not again for 2 years. And the first part of this lesson, or this webinar, is very similar to the past ones we've done, which I've listed here. It's the same core content, but we do, over half of this is also the questions that you've asked in advance, and so those are different from one to the other. And before I forget it, one thing I'll mention is we do record each of these webinars and put them on our website, and so it's probably worth your time if you think the questions are valuable at the end, to go back and find those other videos just to look at the questions, which usually start around 45 minutes or so. So because they're different every time, it's different people asking the questions. And so we can provide the information that lists here, certificate of attendance, copy of the slide deck, and the NEHA forms. And I only have one slide here, but we also, we're working with the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Department of Regulation to provide LEHP credit for Illinois sanitarians, and we're discussing offering CEUs for California sanitarians with RCAC, the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, which is a CEU provider in California. And that's, I don't know that that's quite settled yet, but we're working on it, and I'm going to send them the slide deck after the presentation today. Okay. So quickly, we are funded through RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They're a national organization that provides technical assistance and training all over the country. They have staff in every state. You may be familiar with them in different names: CERCAP in southeastern United States, Midwest Assistance Program in the Upper Plains, RCAC in the West, Communities Unlimited in the Central South, if you will. They're all part of this partnership of organizations that spend a lot of time working on in rural and low-income communities with housing, water and wastewater, and now through our private well program, they have staff in each of these regions who are working with private wells, and I'll mention more of that later. But they fund us, and so if it weren't for RCAP and the work they do, we wouldn't have the program we have today. And so I certainly want to mention them. And as a sanitarian working in either your local or your state health district, if you need the name of the RCAP contact for your state, there's a lot of services they can provide that are part of this grant, so they're free, especially working with well owners, assessing an individual well that may be a problem, things like that. So let us know, email us, and we can hook you up with those guys. So and a little bit about the water survey. I've not included this before, but it's relevant, especially with environmental health professionals. The water survey is a unique agency in the state of Illinois. No other state has a state water survey, although except Oklahoma, which just started one. But we've been around since the 1890s. We started at Noyes Lab, which is where this plaque is at on campus at the U of I, because of a cholera outbreak. And so since then, we were instituted by our state legislature, and we've been around. We have a public service lab, which Dan Webb is one of the folks on the call today, runs our public service lab, and will be answering a lot of your water quality questions. But we've been doing this for a long time. And as an example, I love this slide. We've been going through our historical records, and this is an example of cases of typhoid from 1916 in Pana, Illinois. There are tons of these records that we still have, just to show the work that was done back then trying to solve problems like typhoid and cholera. And so we have a long history, both protecting public health and solving groundwater and surface water and atmospheric science issues for the state of Illinois and beyond. So that's where I'm coming from, and I've been here in 30 years. It's been a great place to work as far as that goes. So about today's webinar, I already mentioned RCAP. It's implemented through RCAP, and also our other partner is the National Environmental Health Association. All the funding comes from US EPA to RCAP. So this is part of a technical assistance and training grant program that EPA provides to help rural and small communities around the country. We are recording it. All these things are made available on YouTube. As you know, when you registered, you were able to sign up and ask questions in advance. We'll answer some of those today. There were a lot, and some we won't get to. But we'll also try to have time at the end. If you have any questions, there's a place on your GoToWebinar screen. It says questions, or it might say chat. Katie Hollenbeck is monitoring that, and we'll make a list of those, and at the end we'll pull them up, and so everybody can see the questions that were asked today. And we'll try to get through some of those. So I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey. I mentioned, and I didn't change this slide. I apologize. It says Katie Hollenbeck. It is now Katie Buckley, who's a water resource outreach specialist at the State Water Survey. And as I mentioned, she's on the call. She just told me my screen wasn't alive, and also we'll be monitoring your questions. And then Dan Webb, I mentioned, head of the public service lab at the survey. Anything related to water chemistry or sampling and those things, Dan is the guy. Our public service lab until 2008 offered free water sampling to any well owner in Illinois. And since that time, there's been a small charge added because of our state budget, for those of you that are aware. But it's still a really cost-effective service, and it provides information on inorganics and metals to any well owner in Illinois that's interested. So today we're going to talk about some of the challenges and issues we face in working with well owners. There are several questions that people asked about how to get well owners to be more receptive, and we're going to touch on that and their attitudes, as well as then a little information about groundwater and wells. There are a number of questions about well types and things like that, and that's part of this talk. And lastly, I want to talk about the gap between groundwater and health professionals, and I'll get into that later, but it's we both need to work with each other. I'm not a health professional. I'm a groundwater scientist. But working with health professionals as much as I do, I've learned that it really takes teams of both to understand the geology, hydrology, and some of the issues related to groundwater flow, as well as all the health information that goes along with sampling results and all that sort of stuff. So, and then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about our program, what we offer, what you can share with well owners that you work with, and go from there. There are a lot of issues out there related to drinking water and well water, but it really comes down to these things: public health protection, source water protection, and water quality. The goal is to protect public health and also protect our source water from contamination, and that all gets back to water quality and water quality issues, and how do we keep contaminants from getting into our drinking water. So that's the focus, even though there's a lot of other issues that are, quote, in the news, if you will. The flooding we had last year in Florida and Texas certainly brought to the forefront the contamination issue in Flint, Michigan, and some other places. We're seeing things with PFOA and PFOS these days. And also then, the idea of non-regulated drinking water seems to be a buzzword, which means drinking water that's not regulated. That would be almost every private well in the country, and any other well that doesn't meet the definition under the Safe Drinking Water Act of a regulated water supply. So, a lot of folks have private wells and choose to have private wells. They wouldn't consider their drinking water unregulated. They just want to be responsible for themselves. And, there's two sides to that, and it's a very, it's kind of a button topic, if you will. So we're not going to go any further than to say those things, when they happen, certainly bring to the forefront issues about drinking water and private wells, and we should use those in our jobs to jump on the bandwagon to get people to test and help them learn more about their wells. But those really aren't the problems that most people face. It really comes down to poor construction. I might be ahead of myself here. I think I am. And this won't go back. What is wrong here? Sorry. There we go. Sorry. It really comes back to simple issues. Not understanding where your water's coming from and why it might be at risk, and well construction. So this, I should love to show this picture because that's 12 foot high, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people to see a well that goes up 12 feet, but that tree line is the edge of a small creek, and it's in a floodplain, and in order to ensure that that well doesn't get flooded and possibly contaminated, they have ran the steel casing up to a level that's above the 100-year floodplain elevation. To me, it's a pretty smart deal and a good idea. So the challenges we face, especially as health professionals or other professionals working with well owners, is it's so different all over the country, which running a national program like we do makes it that much more difficult because there's so many different rules. Even what's the definition of a private well changes. Whether they're permitted or whether they have to submit logs. In Illinois, you had to start permitting and submitting well logs in 1968. In New York, it wasn't until 2000. In Mississippi, you have to get a permit, but you don't file a log unless it's 5 inches or over 5-inch diameter, I believe. And I might be wrong there, but there's some size of the well type of definition involved. So if the well's smaller than that, no log is filed. And so what that leads to is some states have a better idea of how many wells they might have than others. But even in Illinois, we house the state's well logs at the water survey, and we have about 500,000 well logs on file, but there's probably between 800,000 and 1 million private wells actually in use. And so when we go out to do any kind of groundwater study, which applied research is part of our job and mission here, a lot of times we only have information on about half the wells. I mentioned New Jersey and Pennsylvania here because the rules are very different in those states. In New Jersey, about 15 years ago, they passed a law that said anytime a house is sold that has a well or a property sold with a drinking water well, the state has to come out and take a sample. It's a research quality sample. They sample for about 60 constituents. They share the results with the buyer and the seller, and that's it. And it costs, at the time that I first heard about this, was probably 10 years ago. It was $600 for the sample. I don't know if that's the cost anymore. But because of that, New Jersey, their state agency, has information on water quality from about 13,000 wells every year. So probably close to 200,000 water quality samples from all over the state. So they have a really good idea of where there's natural occurring contaminants, where there's other kinds of issues, all that sort of thing. And I put Pennsylvania on the other side of that spectrum because it's there's only 2 states that don't have that don't regulate drillers at a state level, nor do they have well construction code, and that's Pennsylvania and Alaska. And Alaska is about to be out of that club. They've been working. They've got a work group put together where they're looking at developing some rules so that they are doing those things. And it just makes sense to ensure that wells are constructed properly, since that's one of the biggest reasons wells end up being contaminated. So, and the bottom tab here, especially in enforcing what rules they have. There's a number of states where I've went to try to do research work, and even though they require well logs to be filed, they either don't have the staff or don't have the wherewithal to actually enforce those rules, and so they still don't collect a lot of that data, even though they should be, and the statutes say they should. So it just really depends on where you're at. It's all over the map, if you will. And so, and the other thing we've learned is that many county, and I should say local here as well, health departments aren't adequately trained on private well issues, and part of that is there's just not a lot of material out there for sanitarians on private wells. We've had a number of people who taken our class who said, I wish I'd had this when I started my job, because I've learned so much about wells I didn't know. And so, I mean, that certainly sounds good for us, but it's what it really did is the light bulb went on and said we really need to be working with health professionals to make sure that, we can provide some of that information. And what that leads to is a very unorganized local approach to support well owners in most parts of the country. So you may, in the same state, you may have one health department at a county or local level where the person there is very engaged, knows a lot about wells. Maybe they came from that kind of background, and they're providing a lot of support for their well owners, where in the next health district, the staff there may not have that wherewithal. And so because it's not mandatory, I may not even have a program to support their well owners. So it's, it's very local and very different from place to place. So yeah, I've already mentioned this. This is a slide that should have been 2 before, but it really comes down to poor construction, abandoned wells that are still in place that need to be sealed, and lack of well owner knowledge and education. The best example is my dad. I grew up on a 14-foot dug well. When we had a really hard rainstorm, our water was cloudy. So you can tell from that how protective it was of surface contamination. Not at all. My dad swore our well water was much better than city water because it didn't have those chemicals they had. And that was his attitude. It's a very rural attitude, still exists today. Most people assume that if it's in the ground and they're pulling water, there's nothing around them, it has to be safe. And it's just really a matter of us getting out there and educating the public, private well owners anyway, about those issues and why they need to test and some of those things. One of the problems with reaching out to well owners is that they come from every background, every social class, economic class, education class. You have well owners in rural areas, urban areas, wealthy, poor, everything. And so you really are reaching out to, there's no set way to reach all those folks. They're, some are older and they use the newspaper and television for their information. Others are younger and they're using social media. So you have to do all those things to try to reach them. So, and you also have folks who either want to buy this nice 5-acre property in the country, but they lived in a community their whole life and have always had city water, versus, the 5th generation on a family farm. And they just know their well's there, and it's still the same well that was, could be over 100 years old. And we certainly still run into those. So going to the example of a rural area versus an urban setting, Cook County, Illinois is Chicago proper and some of the surrounding suburbs. And so it's a completely urban area. And I guess I didn't include the pictures there, but it's very different in those areas, which you would think there aren't even private wells in an area like Cook County, but there are. There are almost 3,000 just in that one county. And it's partly because of how the community boundaries don't line up in every place. There's unincorporated areas there, and they have private wells. So, Barb Lukonen and several other folks did a study where they sent out questionnaires to 2 counties each in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. And you can see from these numbers, they either offered a free test, a $2 bill, or both, and asked people to return the survey. And so the real takeaways from this are that even though almost 1,100 of the over 1,100 of the 1,700, 33 that actually responded, had never tested their well, 87% said they were either only slightly worried or not worried at all about their well water quality. And they gave them a laundry list of things they could say why they didn't test, and the top 10 are listed here. Number 10, I don't want to know, 8%. I actually have an example of that. We were doing an arsenic study here in Illinois where we were reaching out to folks in rural subdivisions that had wells, trying to look at the spatial variability of arsenic in this particular aquifer. And I ran across a guy who said, you can come sample my well as long as you don't send me the results and you do it when I'm not home. We were using outside spigots for this work. And so I asked him why, and he said because he's trying to sell his house. And in Illinois, there's a law that says when you sell your property, there's a questionnaire you have to fill out that's legally binding, and one of the questions is, do you know of any adverse issues related to your well or drinking water? And he wanted to be able to honestly say no, and so he didn't want to know. So there's a lot of reasons for that. It does become both a legal issue and an economic issue. A home with a contamination problem is less valuable, obviously, in some of those things. And those are issues we struggle with all the time in dealing with well owners. But you can see here, you know, the most common answer was, we've been drinking it for years, so no one's got sick, must be okay. And so we took those and broke them down, and so one thing I'll mention later is we do a 4-hour workshop, and RCAP does as well, and they've done about 30 or 40 of those around the country on how to do outreach to well owners. And it's meant for sanitarians and for other professionals who work with well owners, but we use a lot of Barb Lukonen's work in that. And so we broke those down into 4 types of problems, if you will, or 4 reasons why people don't test. Either they don't know that they need to, and that's kind of on us. They don't know what they should test for. They didn't realize they should test, some of those things. Or they just don't understand that there could be a risk. And so, you know, we have to, I mean, without scaring everyone and being the doomsday, you know, folks, let them know why they need to sample. And, you know, maybe it's likely for a given aquifer that the water is perfectly fine, but unless you test, you're not sure. You know, and even a well-constructed well can have problems. We've run into wells that had tree roots get around the annulus, and it's a PVC well, and eventually, as they grew, cracked the casing. So they have bacteria problems, and that's what it ended up being. So even though it's well-constructed, it meets code, you can still have those issues. Or we find Nebraska did, their State Department of Health and Human, I think it's Health and Human Services, whatever their state agency is that regulates well construction, they did a grout study back in around 2006 using clear pipe that you could see through, and they could camera it all. They tested different kinds of grout in different geologic settings and found that in some cases, even though the state code says you will use this kind of grout, if they use that grout in that geologic setting, it doesn't stay around the annulus, and you end up having a pathway down into the screen, causing problems. So a lot of things can happen here, and there's a lot of ways that we need to go about educating people on those things. Other reasons are hard to reach, just the belief that groundwater is safe, human nature. So why don't people go to the dentist when they need to? Why do they let it go? Because they're concerned about what they're going to find out. Cost or perceived cost. By perceived cost, well, I don't have the money to add treatment even if we do have something in our well. No one's gotten sick, so we're just going to keep it that way. And even down to they want to be independent and don't trust the government, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of reasons, and as someone who's trying to reach out to well owners, your job is to figure out for your given area what the mentality and what the perceived issues are about wells. Is it that they don't know, or is it that they just don't believe it's not safe, or they just want to be left alone, and then deal with it in those respects. So a little bit about aquifers and wells. Usually whenever there is an aquifer available based on geology, then you put in a drilled sand and gravel or a drilled bedrock well, or consolidated rock. When there's no real aquifer available, a lot of cases, especially in the glaciated parts of the country, you can put in a dug or bored well that's in clay and silt, and there might be a thin sand lens that's maybe 2 or 3 inches thick that'll provide enough water for just a home supply. And so we see, for instance, in Illinois, there's no real aquifers in the southern third of the state, and there's a lot of dug and bored wells there, or they're using other supplies like lake supplies or ponds or cisterns and things like that. So depending on where you live, it's just like whether you have oil under your property, you may have choices. We have areas where there might be 3 different aquifers that you could drill into and they have potable water. There are many other places where there's none. So it's just based on your local location, and you may have choices, you may not. Sometimes, like in the southern third of Illinois, there's a significant bedrock aquifer, but it's saltwater. And so it's not potable. It would have to all be treated and desalinated in order to use. And that's not as cost effective as using a lake or pond or a cistern or some other choice, or dug or bored well. So dug or bored wells, they're large diameter wells. And I say dug, that means it was usually hand dug, like the well I grew up on. My grandpa hand dug it in 1933. I grew up on our family farm. A bored well is using a boring machine like what's shown here. If you can look just under those guys' feet, behind the tires, you'll see there's a 3-foot diameter hole there. So they're drilling down, putting in a 3-foot diameter hole, and they'll put concrete tile, usually, 4-foot sections, and just laid in vertically and as the well casing. And then water can seep in between the openings in the tile where they fit together. There's other materials that are being used these days in some cases, but it seeps in from the water table, and thin sand lenses, like I mentioned before. Depending on the state you live in, there may be well construction code that says you can only have the 3-foot casing to 10 feet below land surface, and from there on up it's a 6-inch casing, and they fill that annulus, that hole, with clay material to help protect from surface contamination. Older wells like the one I grew up on are hand dug, that's got uncemented brick all the way around it, and it goes all the way to the surface. So when it rains, water seeps in, and that's the idea there. There wasn't much of a water supply on our 40 acres where I grew up, and so we had an old dug well. It's just that simple. We had no other choice at the time. These are all examples of dug or bored wells. The one in the upper left is an old hand dug well that's still in use today. It's got 2x10s and some tin sheets, and then some rocks and concrete blocks holding it in place. Anything can get in that. Certainly snakes, insects, other small rodents, maybe even larger things like, raccoons or cats or whatever. And it's just not a safe way to go. Compound on that the reason those 4 posts look so worn down is because that's in a cattle pasture, and those 4 posts are the scratching posts for their cattle. And so the cows are there, they're standing in that area, so anything can leach into the ground there. And that's a cornfield that's up gradient from it as well. So, in the spring, if they apply any chemicals and it rains, they're running right into this area. So not ideal as the bottom line. The one on the right is the concrete tile I mentioned that comes all the way to the surface with a concrete pad on top. It's in someone's yard. And the one on the bottom left is also a 3-foot diameter well. It's just that the upper 10 feet or 15 feet is a 6-inch casing coming up. So it looks like it's a drilled well. But at 10 or 15 feet below land surface, it expands out to a 3-foot diameter well where water can seep in. So there's, it's hard to tell unless you know the construction. And So, and here's 2 of those examples, the way, at least in Illinois, they're put in today. The one on the left has concrete tile going all the way to the surface. In this example, it's recommended that you put 6 inches of concrete around the tile, all the way around it for the upper 10 feet or so, 10 feet minimum it says. And that's, concrete or clay, grout, in order to prevent water from running along the annulus or in the borehole outside the well and getting down to some of those seams. The other way to construct it is on the left, or on the right, excuse me, where the concrete tile part starts at below 10 feet, and it's just a 6-inch casing going up to the surface. And then it really looks just like a regular drilled well. If you're in a colder climate where you have a pitless adapter, that's what this is showing here, where it goes to the pressure tank and going into the house. That's just that's common construction today. And you may put gravel around down towards the bottom. That gives you a little extra storage. And as I mentioned, the reason you have a dug or bored well is because there's no real aquifer, either bedrock or sand and gravel, available. And so what you're really doing here is you're storing water. That's why it's 3-foot diameter or bigger. We've seen dug wells that are 20 foot in diameter with a corn bin lid on them. And that's just because there's not much water. They're getting water from the water table that's seeping through maybe more clayey, tilly soil, and it's a way to store it. And so it's kind of like a cistern. It's just underground, if you will, and it's pulling water from the saturated zone below the water table versus, from a roof into a cistern. Sand and gravel wells have a screen. That the screen is the only part of the well that actually produces water. A typical well has a 4-foot to maybe 10-foot screen. That's usually overkill unless it's a larger diameter well for pumping a higher quantity of water. But this is a steel wrapped screen. The slots that are in these screens are sized based on the sand grain size. So a driller usually has to have a lot of these on hand if they're used to drilling sand and gravel wells. And this is at the bottom. So if I drill a 200-foot well into sand and gravel aquifer, a buried sand and gravel aquifer, the casing might be solid from ground surface down to 195 or 196, and then that last 4 or 5 feet would have the screen, and that's where the water's coming in the well. And the pressure of the water in the aquifer is going to push water up in the well. You put your submersible pump in below that so that you can pump from it. The real key here for water quality and for surface protection is that the water's coming in the well at 196 feet, well below land surface. So as long as the casing and the outside of the borehole is grouted properly, it's very protected from surface contamination. We have wells in Illinois, because we're glaciated in the northern 2/3 of the state, that are 300 or 400 feet deep that are still in sand and gravel. We haven't in bedrock yet. I know in some states you don't have any glaciated terrain, so the only time you see sand and gravel is in a river bottom, an alluvial sand in those areas. So so that's a lot different. And here's a typical well log. This is only a 45-foot well. There's 4 feet of topsoil and then 41 feet of sand. So in this case, there's only 4 feet of material above the aquifer. We have other areas where the sand is right at the surface, and those are probably less protective just because water can infiltrate. The soil type at the surface is more sandy, so more water infiltrates into the ground. And so if it's near any farming or livestock or any of those things, it's probably going to, more of it will infiltrate than run off, versus an area where there may be 100 feet of clay before you hit any sand and gravel. But you can see from a log, and this varies by state, there's pump information, there's location information, where it's coming from, water's coming from. They've got they've got 41 feet of galvanized pipe, and then a 4-foot casing, 4-foot screen. So water's actually coming in from 41 to 45 feet, just those 4 feet. So it's solid pipe from 0 to 41. On the flip side of that, we have a bedrock well. Typically, whenever you drill into bedrock, so in this picture, it says overburden and saturated overburden. That's the sand, gravel, clay, glacial material, alluvial sand, or loess, or whatever. Then you hit bedrock, which is the gray. And typically, when you put in a bedrock well, you only have the casing go into the well 10 or 20 feet. And then you seed it there, is what it's called. But you've already drilled a hole that's much deeper. So in our example of a 200-foot well, if the overburden here were, say, 40 feet, then the casing might only be 50 or 60 feet down. And below that, your 200-foot well is open. It's the rock itself is the casing. So, and the reason you do that is because bedrock itself doesn't provide much water. It's the fractures in the rock that allow water to flow. And in most cases, sandstones can have secondary porosity and things like that allow more water. But typically limestone, dolomite, granite, some of the other sources of bedrock water supplies are all using fractures. And so you have that open, you drill through and try to hit fractures because that's where your water is going to come in. That's, if you hit a good set of fractures as you're drilling a well, you may have a lot of water. We have some areas in the state where they're drilling into bedrock to pump irrigation wells that may pump 1,500 gallons a minute. That means there's a lot of fractures available and a lot of water available. In other areas that may not be possible. But the other side of that is fractures are more like a piping system. So water's only coming through the fractures. When you start pumping your well and lower the pressure at the wellhead, water starts coming towards the well to fill that back in based on pressure. So water's flowing through those cracks to your well. If there aren't many fractures, then it could be coming from further away. Or in the example here, you see how 2 of those fractures are slanted up towards the surface. If you're in an area that doesn't have any overburden, it may be direct conduit. A fracture in the rock may be able to get right to your well even, a quarter or half mile away. So bedrock wells are a little more unknown, if you will, as far as where the water is actually coming from, especially if it pumps very much water. It's going to pull it from further away, and it could be pulling from fractures that are shallower, and so it could cause, could be more of a risk for contamination. And this is a bedrock log from Illinois. The only thing I'll point out here, you can see on the number 18, the formations that were drilled through. They drilled through 26 feet of sand near the surface. It's probably wasn't saturated or barely saturated or wasn't consistently saturated, which is why they went ahead and blew through that. And then they went through some clay, and they got to broken limestone at 187 feet. Then they went through limestone for 68 feet, it says, and then they hit shale. Shale is like a cemented clay. It doesn't produce water. It's an aquitard or aquiclude, and so the water here is coming from the limestone. The person who filled this out was probably someone in the office for this driller, and they're used to seeing the bottom formation being the formation that provides the water. So on number 12 up here, they wrote in shale from 257 to 260 as a water-bearing unit. That's a mistake. They drilled 3 feet into shale and realized that they didn't want to go any further because they had 68 feet of limestone. And so the water is actually coming from the 189 to 257. So what's interesting else here is that for number 15, they used PVC casing to 179 feet, 10 feet before they got into the bedrock. And then they used 20 feet of black steel casing to seat into the bedrock. So it's at 199. So they went 10 feet into the bedrock, and that's where the casing stops. So from 199 to 260, it's just an open borehole. And that's, again, to take advantage of the fractures that they might encounter as they drill through that. The static water level was 130 feet, and when they pumped it at 25 gallons a minute for 2 hours, it dropped to 160. A home well is probably going to be 5 GPM or less needed, if you will, unless it's, in some areas you can't get that much. But this is a very high-producing well for any kind of home supply. So it's just interesting how these things are put together and what they all mean. And like I said, every state has their own version of these logs, and you're probably familiar with your states. Or like in Illinois, our county health departments actually do the permitting, and the logs are submitted to them. So our county sanitarians are very familiar and inspect wells when they're drilled. So what to do about well construction code and poor construction? Well construction codes have evolved over time. In Illinois, I know the dug well or the bored well code had changed about 12 years ago to make it a little more strict or a little more protective. But in every case, when in any state, when well construction code is changed or added, existing wells are grandfathered in. So there's many wells that are still in pits today, even though they're not allowed in most states. And there are also many hand-dug wells, like the one I grew up on, and it was hand-dug in 1933, that are still in use. So those are typically where we find our problems. A lot of these issues are because it's an old well that's not protective at the surface, and but it still provides water. Folks are used to drinking it. In my own situation, I drank that water my entire time growing up. And then when I went to college and started drinking water from a community water supply that was chlorinated, within 6 months, I could not drink our water anymore at home. It made me sick. And so you don't realize those things because your body gets used to it. And that's why folks will tell you, I've drank this water my whole life. It's, it's great. It's fine. It tastes great. It's better than city water. That's irrelevant. So the other thing about old wells, or especially wells in pits, they provide an opportunity not only for surface contamination, but they're a safety hazard. So, a lot of times those pits are covered by an old piece of plywood or, some old door that eventually rots. It's always been that way, so people don't change, and they just cause problems. And here's several examples. I will apologize for the picture on the right, but it does what it's supposed to do. That is a goat. Down in an old dug well that fell in, and no one noticed it for quite a long time. And so in the picture on the upper left is a well in Washington State. The Washington State Department of Ecology actually has a blog They're the agency in Washington State that regulates well construction and well drillers licensing. And so they have a blog where they post pictures of things whenever things like this happen. The woman who fell to her death here stepped on that piece of plywood and it broke through and it ended up killing her. But you can see that piece of concrete, that flat piece of concrete was meant to cover that probably 5-inch square hole. You can see the pump sitting there. That she's probably walked across that thousands of times and it never caused any problems. And this looks like it's in a well house. But the problem is there's an old funnel laying there. There's an old piece of string. You can see the broom and an old piece of pipe. That looks like insulation that's laying around the well. All that stuff, just by kicking around in there, you're knocking down in the well. And, it becomes, some of it dissolves, becomes part of your water supply. And so it's just not the right way to have your well protected as if you're going to use it as a drinking water supply. So what should you do? Try to bring them up to code if you can. That's what we tell people. Sometimes people don't have the funding to do that. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it later today or not, but USDA does have a program for providing funds or low-interest loans to well owners, either to put in a well or to upgrade their well or to add treatment if it's a health issue. Some of it's based on economics, how much money they make, or there's some, for older folks, there's also other programs that USDA has. If you want information on that, you can let me know. 3 of the 6 RCAP regions actually have those loan funds available and can work with well owners or with the health department in order to help, especially in worst case scenarios where you've got families that are, I sampled a well at the request of a city, and they had 6 kids, and their arsenic was at 257 ppb. And they had no money to add treatment. And so, there's cases where you just need to find a way. So, but what you should do, if you can, extend the pipe up to the surface, fill it in the annulus area. If this is a pit, extend the pipe up to the surface, add clay, grout around the outside. If you're in a colder area, install a pitless, and then talk to, either the health department or contractor, find out what's best for that area, and what they might be able to do as far as come up with a plan. And we encourage well owners all the time to talk to their county health department and talk to their extension person. They're there to help. They're there to help. They want to make sure that you're protected. And in 99% of the country, a health department can offer advice, but they can't tell you can't drink your water. Now, that's not at all true in a few places these days, but in general, we tell folks that you're there to help them and may suggest that you don't drink the water, but they can't tell you you can't. So, yeah. So the other piece of this is abandoned wells. Because well logs weren't required until the 60s or much later in some cases, there are a lot of old wells out there. People buy an old farmstead, tear it down, build a new house, put in a new well, and there's still an old well somewhere. And like wells and pits, they're a safety hazard. You hear all the time where people have fallen in a well or a livestock or a tractor, broken axle because it hit an old well. And if, we tell well owners, if you have an abandoned well on your property, you need to properly abandon it, seal it, following your state's rules, so that, you aren't responsible if somebody wanders onto your property and falls in an abandoned well. It could really be a problem for you. So here's some examples. Again, the 2 pictures are both from the Washington State Department of Ecology in their blog. One's a horse in a well, and the other one they pulled a man out who fell 45 feet. Miraculously, he wasn't hurt. But the newspaper clippings over here are all from the late 90s. The third one, those of you that are old enough, remember Jessica McClure. It was carried live on CNN for 18 hours while they rescued her from a well. She'd fallen in, and she's grown and has her own kids today. The other 3 are all from regional papers in Illinois, Galesburg, Buffalo Grove, and Springfield. And, folks die. They fall in these wells. No one knew they were there. And they're much more of a risk than probably people realize. And it happens more often if you're not looking for it. So the last thing I want to bring up here is about the gap for groundwater professionals and health professionals. So, a lot of times I know we've been approached by different groups, some federal health agencies, about doing studies looking multi-state at how groundwater or private well water may affect cancer rates or some other things. And when we start, we sit down and show them the maps of where all the aquifers are and wells that are not in an aquifer per se, and all the complications that go along with that. They don't really want to work with us anymore. They were hoping to do the 3-state study, and this actually happened. And we explained that there's probably 60 different aquifers in use and a number of wells in the region they were looking at where there was no aquifer, but they were all dug or bored wells or sand points. And so the water quality could be different from well to well, and you couldn't really lump it all together and assume things. Even in the same location, in some places we have wells in 2 or 3 different aquifers because there are 2 or 3 different aquifers available. And so some people choose to go deeper just so that they don't ever have an issue 40 years later. Some people just put it in the first aquifer they encounter because it saves them money. And so it's complicated, and that's the whole issue, and why you need to have folks that understand geology and groundwater flow and those things. Just like our arsenic issue I mentioned earlier, arsenic in this particular aquifer that we were studying is not a contaminant transport issue. It doesn't move with the groundwater. It's in place, it's in situ, and it depends on the chemistry whether or not it's released into the water near a well or not. So you can't even model it with a groundwater flow model to determine where it's going to go like a plume would, because it doesn't follow those characteristics. So you have to understand all those things, and you really need someone who understands that. Also, water well issues for private wells are not straightforward. I mentioned Johns Hopkins here. I left the S off Johns. They're not a community water supply issue. Private wells have, community water supplies can be groundwater or be surface water, and that's why I bring this up. They listed, I went to a private well symposium there, and they were listing a bunch of general issues that related to private well contamination. And one of the things they listed were algal toxins, which is a surface water problem. And, my belief is they just took a list from the EPA's website for community water supplies and what the hot issues were, and they listed that, not understanding that private wells don't have that issue. So there's also an issue, I know there's a question about this later, groundwater sample versus a drinking water sample. The water coming out of your well before it gets in your house or it goes through treatment can be much different in the chemistry than the water coming out of the kitchen tap. And I will address that later, but that's why we collect 2 samples in a lot of cases. Because once it sits in your pipes or it goes through a softener or RO or whatever, you've changed the chemistry. And so, you need to understand where the sample came from and some of those things. Dealing with water well construction issues as well. And the last one here is really important. No information on treatment or bottled water. A lot of people move out to the country because they want to live in a quieter, more open place, and rather than deal with having a private well, they may use it for their garden and their bathtub, but they use bottled water or they treat it. So the water chemistry for what they're drinking may be different than their neighbors because they don't treat theirs. And we have no information on who has treatment or who decides to drink bottled water at their homes. So whenever you go into an area, you have no idea if there's an elevated cancer risk or if there's an area where there's elevated cancer rates. You have no idea if people are drinking water from the ground or they're actually drinking bottled water, what percentage of the population is doing all those things. It would take a lot of work to figure that out. So the bottom line is we can all learn from each other. And so if you're going to work on issues related to private wells, your team should really have both. And I mentioned, I listed here, I don't remember I already mentioned the high arsenic example, but I don't remember what the lagoon example was now. So I'm going to skip that. Yeah. Okay, so this just is a cross-section. So at the top is land surface, at the bottom is bedrock, and it shows that this is an area where I've done a lot of work in Illinois. There's a significant aquifer, the one at the bottom that's in yellow called the Sankoti Sand Member is the Muhammad Aquifer. It extends over 16 counties in Illinois. 800,000 people or so use it for water supply. But you can see all the little dotted areas are sand. There's also silt, clay, till, there's organic matter up near the top, the Robine silt. There's 3 sets of glaciation that came through Illinois in this area. And so you can have near superficial sands, and depending on where you drill, you could hit 5 or 6 different sand layers, and a driller might decide to put a well in any one of those. So they aren't all connected. They have different water quality, or they could, depending on the makeup of their original sand. And I mentioned arsenic is a problem in some of this aquifer, and that's because the actual material that makes up the aquifer itself has arsenopyrite in it, which is iron pyrite that's got arsenic bound to it. And it depends on the chemistry whether that arsenic can be released into solution or not, how reducing the conditions are. So, it varies a lot from one place to another. Even the chemistry can change. So that's why, that's the point. So the best thing to do is to develop a relationship with your scientific surveys or resource agency, the USGS, your state GS. In Illinois, we have a water survey. Also, Wisconsin DNR, Michigan DEQ, those are examples. In every state, they may have a different name, but in many states, they're the Department of Public Health, as well as county or state extension. All those folks have some information and can help with your work. In most cases, they're very interested in what you might be doing as a health professional, trying to look at private well issues. What we tell well owners is they should call those places and ask them for advice. Tell them where you live. They can tell you if there's a different aquifer, what if there's natural occurring contaminants. Right now I know in Tazewell County they have arsenic in Illinois in some places. So I know the Tazewell County Health Department knows about that. But there's some, not all the well owners do, and they can either call their health department or one of these other agencies to work with to find out how far that extends, how far the aquifer extends, all those things. They want to help, and that's my job here in Illinois, is to work with our health departments for those exact things. So anyway, enough about that. So I'm going to go over some things on the private well class really quick. So if you're not familiar, this webinar is part of our program for the private well class, which privatewellclass.org is a site for well owners. There's a 10-lesson class that you can take. It's self-paced. You sign up. It sends you an email once a week for 10 weeks. And I'll get into it later, but sanitarians can actually take it on NEHA's webpage and get CEU credit for it for each of the lessons. In addition, we have a lot of other multimedia stuff. We're active on social media and some of those other things too, trying to help well owners understand what their responsibilities are. This is our front page. You click on Learn by Email, and it takes you to a place to sign up. We have podcasts and videos, and there's a lot of resources under Resource Library, and I'm going to go through some of those really quick. There's 10 lessons, as I mentioned. These are the first 2, the science of groundwater and groundwater well contamination. This is actually part of the Resource Library, and these are other free publicly available documents that a well owner can look through if for some reason when they went through lesson 1 of ours, which is also free, some concepts didn't make sense to them. There's more material here that are related so that you can find, or supplemental material like in lesson 2, the Michigan Flowing Well Handbook. I mean, who knew that in Michigan they cap flowing wells because not so many years ago they were losing 28 million gallons a day of groundwater to wells that were flowing, and it was just discharging to a local water body. So now they cap their wells, and that's what that handbook's all about. So a lot of cool things going on that you don't realize until you start looking. We've also developed a completely Spanish version of our class in all 10 lessons. And so if you have well owners who are native Spanish speakers or prefer things in Spanish, that's available to them as well. All the lessons have been translated, even the figures, into Spanish so that they can be, the whole thing can be ingested that way if someone's interested. The goal of this overall program, though, is really just to educate well owners, to help them understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and so that they can then protect themselves and their family from risk, especially health risks and contamination. And so if they have an old well in a pit, they'll learn why that's a bad thing, why you should have certain types of well construction and meet code, and why you should always use a licensed driller, all that sort of stuff. So we do webinars every month, as I mentioned. This one's for environmental health professionals, but the one I've highlighted on screen is a webinar we did in August of 2016 on lead. And we didn't do this by ourselves. I worked with Virginia Tech and with the US EPA to pull some slides that some of their staff had on known issues related to lead. It's a little different for a private well in that not only are you not treating water like a community water supply does in most cases, but it really depends on the natural groundwater quality to understand what it might do when it gets into your lead pipes. Having lead pipes doesn't mean you're going to have lead in your drinking water. As you all probably know. And so we went through a lot of those issues as well as treatment options and things like that. And we also created a lead page. It's just privatewellclass.org/lead, and it gives you a lot of resources from CDC and EPA and other agencies on what you can do as a well owner to look at whether or not lead might be an issue for you. So, and older homes before 1986 especially likely have more lead in the plumbing system than newer ones. And anything before 2014 could have lead solder and some lead in the brass that could be a problem. So a lot of old homes out there that have private wells. That's the bottom line. We put together a series of 16 training videos on different topics. What do I do when my well goes dry? What do I do after a flood? This one on what should I know about a shared private well. It's interesting. Some states regulate shared wells even down to 2 homes on a well, like Washington State does. Others have no rules, like Illinois. One of my coworkers actually shares a well with 3 other homes. They have no idea if there's anything in their deed or anything else that might protect them should that owner sell and the new person who moves in says, I'm not going to share my well anymore. So there's a lot of issues that you don't realize. Or maybe someone built 2 or 3 homes when they had this one farmstead, and now it's all been sold off. There's just a lot of issues like that, and we've tried to address those through these short videos. We've got a podcast series that's not complete. It goes through the first 3 lessons. That's 1, 2, and 3 on this list, and then the others are interviews we've done for RFD Illinois through Farm Bureau, talking about different issues related to private wells. We hope to complete the rest of those at some point. They're actually a lot of work, but they're interesting. We've had well over 2,000 downloads of our podcasts, and it's just another way to reach people. And as far as environmental health professionals, we've developed a lot more material for you. I mentioned NEHA has our class on their e-learning website. You can get up to 10 CEs for sanitarians, and if we probably don't have any home inspectors, but ASHI also uses NEHA's website to give accreditation for their home inspectors who need CEUs. So hopefully we're educating a lot of the folks that are out there working with well owners and buying property and all those sorts of things as well. RCAP staff are hosting workshops around the country for environmental health professionals, both a 4-hour workshop on how to do outreach and an assessment tool, which I'll mention in a minute, but also other workshops where we've already done 30 or 40 of those, and in the evaluation part of that, we've asked, hey, what do you want more training on? And the sanitarians who are there have given us a laundry list of things that they say they need more guidance with, and so we've developed curriculum around some of that for these workshops. And so I know this coming year now, RCAP plans to do a number of workshops that are probably 2-hour workshops related to some of that stuff. And we've developed an assessment tool, which is kind of like a sanitary survey, if you're familiar with that. It's meant to evaluate risk of a well and look at the vulnerability. We developed it in 2016. RCAP staff have done a lot of these assessments where they work one-on-one with a well owner and go out and show them where their well might be vulnerable, deficient, and give them recommendations of what they need to do. We are developing a guide to go with that. It's pretty complicated. You actually have to have a lot of wherewithal as the person filling it out to do it. It's not for a well owner to do themselves. And we're working with our IT staff to develop a tablet version for iOS and Android as well, at request of RCAP staff, actually. So we do have a partners page, which really is, and a partner newsletter, which is really just meant for professionals working in the field. This is where you can sign up for that. And by signing up as an outreach partner, it really just means you're going to get our newsletter. We let you know ahead of time about things like we just did a brochure, if any of you received that. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes too. But it's really just signing up to get our newsletter, which is geared towards not well owners, but the folks that serve them, about other programs around the country, about materials that are available, things like that. Further down that page, you can see our newsletter archive and this brochure I'm going to talk about in a minute that we just developed. It's something to hand out to well owners in your jurisdiction. Here's a just our September newsletter from last year, we did a video on how to abandon an old dug well. This happened to be an old dug well that was actually in the middle of a community of 15,000. They've had public water since 1916, I believe, and yet the person who bought this property called the Groundwater Guardians group that's in the area and said, I think I have a dug well in my backyard. And sure enough, they had a 21-foot dug well that I don't know if you can tell it here, but their foundation is starting to cave out and instead of being round, it's starting to be flat on the left side because there's a big open hole there. So that's a well driller who's filling that in with bentonite. And we created a video working with the county health department, a number of other folks there, the Department of Geology at Western. This was in Macomb, Illinois. And so it was really a cool day. They made it a training event for sanitarians. A bunch of people from some of the surrounding counties come in. And so we try to provide information like that. I mentioned our 4-hour workshop. We actually did it online. RCAP runs an in-person workshop in different states, and I can get you information if you're interested on when those are going to be. But we do it online. And the last one we did was in January. We haven't set a date for the next one, but I think we had 157 people take it. And it really covers our assessment tool and also how to do outreach to well owners in much more detail than I did today. And it's approved for NEHA CEUs. And yeah, you can, again, ask us about that as well. Quickly, the site assessment we put together, we brought in the end, we had 13 people from around the country, extension, public health, hydrologists, drillers, a state agency guy who does private well work, and all folks who had more than 20 years experience working with private wells, and we worked together to develop this tool. It's a site assessment, a well assessment, a geologic assessment, and what it really does is gives us a chance to go out in the field, and RCAP, who's doing a lot of the on-the-ground work for this program, to go out and work with a well owner one-on-one and walk through all the potential issues and ask them about if they treat, if they had a water sample, what kind of pipes do they have, then they take a look at the well, all that stuff. And it gives you a chance to look at their well log or find their well log for them, talk about best management practices, or if they have any other issues like they're in a bottom ground where they might flood, or they're in karst topography where there might be an issue. And it's a chance to talk to them one-on-one about, here's what they can do to kind of mitigate that, or why they need to test more often, or whatever. So it's really meant to be something that helps well owners. Like it says here, it's like a sanitary survey. It gives us a chance to educate well owners, and it also encourages them to communicate. A lot of well owners don't realize until they have a problem. I mean, most of the calls I get from well owners are because they have a problem. They're not out there trying to learn more about their well. And I still encourage them, they need to take our class and they be able to ask better questions and more intelligent questions if they just knew the basics of how to be a good steward of their well. So RCAP's done, I said 1,100 here, but it's probably closer to 1,500 now around the country. Again, I mentioned the workshops. They've done over 30 of those around the country, and over 600 professionals have been trained on how to use it. It also is an opportunity then to develop partnerships with county and state health departments, extension, other groups, other agencies, labs, so that whenever there's an opportunity for even a well owner workshop, they may ask you to come in and give a presentation as well and work with them to lead a workshop in your area. So we see a lot of that going on now because of this program. I want to mention we held a conference, the first private well conference last May. It was here in Champaign, and we invited all the speakers. So we brought in experts on all the issues that we felt were important related to private wells. And one of our county health department people came up to me afterward that I know really well, and she said this is the first conference she's ever been to where every talk was relevant to what she does every day with private wells. And so we're really proud of what came out of this. We ended up having 117 people from 32 states, and for the first conference, that's pretty good. There were 39 talks, and if you go to webinars and events and scroll over that on our webpage, one of the drop downs is the private well conference. It takes you to this page, and that's Barb Lukonen, who I used her stuff earlier in this presentation talking about the 2,700 questionnaires they sent out. But you can click on 2.5 day agenda to see what the talks were all about, and you can go to YouTube. We recorded every one of them. So even if you weren't there and you wish you were there, you can go watch every one of the talks. And so we tried to put all that together. We brought in drillers to talk to the health professionals about their side of the story. We had a lot of health professionals speak at our conference, and we opened it, and the best part was it was free. We made it free because we hope to do this every 2 years and move it around the country so that locally, health department folks who don't have travel dollars can still come. They just have to get there. So we are planning one for 2019. We don't have a place yet, but it will be probably about the same time frame, about a week or so after most of the universities get out, and probably in a smaller college town somewhere out east is my hope. We just did this brochure. It's a trifold, and it's meant to be given out to local health departments or labs who want to pass this out to well owners. There's a place right above the RCAP logo here where you could put your own sticker with your contact information. We put this out in our newsletter and made it available for free. We had requests for 24,000 questionnaires or brochures. So we printed a little over 30,000 of them. They're in English and in, this is the back half. It basically says why you need to test your well. These are the practices you should be doing to be a better steward of your well. And step 3, to learn more about your well, here's the information for our class. And we developed a Spanish version as well. We had over 130 local and state agencies request 24,000 of these. And I got to go back. And we still have some left. So if you're interested, let us know. And if we get more requests down the road, we're going to print another set of them. But yeah, you can take a look at it. If you go to our webpage under the partner resources, you can click on this and see it. I will tell you, if you download it as a PDF and print it yourself, the PDF will have little white edges and then the folds don't work right. So we are willing to print them and mail them to you for free as part of our grant. We want to get this information out there, and we think it's a useful document, and so I just wanted to point that out. So we did receive a lot of questions in advance, and we're going to go through some of those, and Dan is going to help me. Hopefully he's not asleep and still on the call.
No, I'm here, Steve. Yep.
And if we don't answer your question today, and it's really something that you want some more information on, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. I said, we had 300 people register for today, and so we received a lot of questions, and there's only so many we can do, and we also figure that folks will have questions just from some of the stuff I've mentioned today. And so, as I said before, you can go to the question box or the chat box, and you can ask us questions there. And it looks like we have a couple. But first of all, I'm going to go through some of the questions that we received. And so a lot on what should we test for. And so we came up between my boss, who runs our groundwater section, is a chemist, and Dan, who runs our lab, and some other folks here. We came up with everyone suggests you sample annually for coliform and nitrate. Those, coliform isn't necessarily a health risk. It's an indicator that there's a pathway into your well. And the same really with nitrate. I mean, it can be a health risk for babies and pregnant mothers. But the idea is those are simple tests. They're very cheap, and they give you a way to indicate if there's a pathway into your well. And then to better understand the water quality of your well water, we recommend this list in the middle. Some of it's about whether it's galvanized piping or not, or some of those things, or if you have copper piping. But this gives, what it gives us is an idea of some of the general chemistry of the groundwater versus. So Dan will tell you that most well water in Illinois has a pH of 7.5 or higher, which means we're at less risk of, having conditions favorable to leak, or, Anyway, I'm going to have lab. Yeah, corrosion problems. Thank you. But in other areas, like in Virginia, the Piedmont Aquifer, the pH there is 5.5. And so it's much more likely that if you have galvanized pipe or copper or old lead pipes, that you're going to not have any scale buildup, but just the opposite, you're going to start having corrosion problems. So, but it really depends on your location and your situation, type of piping you have, all those things. And so it's not only this list, but you may have other things that are unique to your area, and there are natural occurring contaminants that you know, again, if your state or local health department isn't aware, then you know, maybe contact a state geological survey or other department like a DEQ, and they may have that information. Hopefully, though, everyone at the county and state level and the health side already knows if there's an area where there might be arsenic or some other contaminant. And as a few examples, I always show this no matter who I'm talking to, because the part of this is about being inquisitive. And so, you know, in Massachusetts, they have a website at their DEP. Type in your address, and it'll tell you whether there's a risk of uranium or arsenic. So there's a lot of it out there, and this will tell you they've mapped it, they know where it's at, and so, you know, it's just meant to be a helpful tool for you as a health professional or a well owner. And, you know, many health professionals are also well owners, we've learned. And so there's things like this. This is on Rhode Island's website. The little circles are all where there used to be orchards, and there's a lot of arsenic contamination, especially in the soil. So if you have a shallower well or a well that's not properly protected, and you're in one of those little areas, they're saying, you know, you should test for arsenic. And the big splotch that's in the middle is beryllium. And that's the reason I showed this slide. I did not realize that beryllium is a regulated contaminant under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it is, and it has health effects. And so if you happen to be in Rhode Island and you're in this area, you should be sampling for beryllium, which isn't something that just rolls off your tongue and people do every day. So that's why you need to be inquisitive, try to find out what locally might be an issue. And some states have even taken this step further. Wisconsin DNR worked with University of Stevens Point to develop this mapping tool that you can search by county or by township for different numbers of a bunch of different contaminants. So these are all groundwater samples that they've collected. And so I clicked on up in the upper right, county and arsenic, and it's showing me which counties average less than 5 is the green, I believe. And then the other colors, they're going to the red, greater than 21. That's the average arsenic value for the samples they've had in those counties. It could be 3 samples, it could be 300, depending on whether the state's done any work there. You know, a number of the counties, if you look, are clear. That means they have 0 samples for those counties. But if I'm, you know, moving to Wisconsin and I'm going to be near Green Bay and buy a well with a private, buy a home with a private well, I'm going to sample it for arsenic before I buy. That's the bottom line there, because it's certainly looks like there's a potential for it. So these things are meant to be helpful. That's the bottom line, and a lot of states are developing these tools. I know a number of states that are getting funding through CDC are developing some sort of GIS-based system to look at either raw water quality or well information, things that will help you even find more information about your area. So where to sample and why? So we had several questions talking about whether you take your sample outside or after treatment, and someone asked about, well, I end up telling people that they need to do something with their treatment if they sample in the house because there's always problems. Well, what our lab does when someone calls and asks for a sample is asks if they have treatment or some other situation that may warrant collecting 2 different samples. And we typically take an outside sample outside a spigot that's before any kind of treatment, and then one at the kitchen tap. And as you probably know, they can be very different, especially if it's treated. And we have an example of that we use in our 4-hour workshop that I'm going to go through really quickly. So this is a sample from 1990. This is actually from 2015. This is the sample that's outside before any kind of treatment. And Mahomet's fairly close to Champaign, Illinois. You can see this is the raw sample. The hardness down at the bottom is 351. The pH is 8.202. The sodium's 25.9. So after it runs through the softener and the filter, now the sodium's 198. The pH is still about the same, 8.1, and now the hardness is down to 0.68. So the softener and the filter did their job. This person also has an RO unit on their kitchen tap, and the less than signs here mean it's below detection for the equipment in our lab. After RO, most things are not detectable, and it's taken a lot more out, but the pH dropped to 6.23. At the kitchen tap, that's probably not as big of a deal, and depending on the piping in this home, but there are whole house RO units, not many because they're expensive, but if someone had a whole house RO unit, they might be lowering their pH or causing other unintended consequences that they didn't realize. So collecting more information is always better, and it's awesome that this person decided to do this and collect these 3 samples, because it really gives you a feel for what can change in water quality from a private well. This is a 240-foot well in a sand and gravel aquifer. Talking about well disinfection, we always get a lot of questions about that. And I actually just used this slide from before. This wasn't the exact question, but the bottom line is, people hear all the time, I should just throw some chlorine down my well every month. I had a person tell me that their driller told them to put a cup of bleach in their well once a month and that would take care of it. That's not the way to do things. You should only put chlorine in your well when you've sampled and you show that you have bacteria. Otherwise you don't need it. And it should be mixed first so that it's not at a concentration that's going to hurt rubber seals or cause leaching of metals, some of those things. We've looked at a lot of resources that are available on how to disinfect your well, and the one that we choose to share with well owners is the one from Minnesota Department of Health, and it's on our webpage. If you look under library resources, I think under lesson 10, it's one of the last links there. It just says well disinfection, but it's under lesson 10. And it's a really nice procedure. It steps you through, shows you pictures, tells you how much to mix based on well depth and size, tells you to turn off your power, a lot of common sense things that people need to do, why to use laundry bleach that doesn't have perfumes in it, all that stuff, even what to do with your water treatment equipment. In some cases, they recommend you go to the Water Quality Association and look at the manufacturer's recommendations for a particular kind of treatment, but also why you need to bypass those, things like that. So it's a really nice document, and again, you can link to it from our webpage, but it's by the Minnesota Department of Health. So Dan, I'm going to give this to you because we get this question all the time, if that's okay, about,
sure.
So sometimes when you sample a well and it has bacteria, you disinfect, and then you keep having a bacteria problem. And there doesn't seem to be an obvious reason. The person who asked this question basically said the well seems to be intact, but they keep getting bacteria hits. So, what do you do? And yeah.
So typically, I would say Steve probably has covered this in this class various times. But the first thing is always look. It sounds like the particular question here was, if they know that they can't find the solution. But it's always a good idea to look for a problem in your well, a breach. Steve makes a good note here with tree roots causing a crack in the casing. You might have your well contractor come out and rather than having to deal with continuous chlorination forever, I would have somebody come out and have a look and see if they can see any flaws in the the top 10 feet or whatever would be reasonable of the well casing. If you've got spilled a manure lot or spilled fertilizer or something, look for those kind of sources. If you can't find anything else, then you'll probably have to go with continuous disinfection. Now, I have had some public health people tell me before that the bacteria grows in layers, or maybe sort of like it filters through pores and porous surfaces. So it might be a good idea to try the disinfection or the chlorination more than once before you just say forever I'm going to have a continuous chlorinator. One time somebody said it took a customer 7 times to chlorinate. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's also the case whenever they have the sulfur smell from bacteria.
Yeah, that's kind of the same advice, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Can you drill too deep for water? So, there were a number of questions this time that were not water quality related, which was more interesting for me anyway. But, so in general, water can be found at a bunch of different depths, which I already explained. I grew up on a well that was 14 feet deep. In northern Illinois, there are private wells that are nearly 2,000 feet deep into a sandstone aquifer. You could also run into salt water. In some parts of Illinois anyway, you can hit salt water in bedrock at less than 200 feet. So it really depends on the geology, but some rules of thumb that I go by anyway is that, one, the deeper you go, you're going to hit water, but it's more likely to be saline, so salt water. And in that case, it's pretty cost prohibitive to use that as a water supply. So, and the other thing about bedrock aquifers, I talked about the fractures you're trying to hit, and that's where the water is really coming from in most types of bedrock. What we see is that as you go deeper, the fracture frequency and size tend to decrease. So if you haven't hit some decent fractures and have a decent water supply, and you're 200 feet into bedrock, your odds of hitting more fractures and more water deeper gets less and less. So, you need to really consult with a geologist or a well driller or your state geological survey and look at the area you're in and determine whether, there is no one size fits all answer to this. And we had a number of questions like that. It really comes down to a local issue and someone who understands the geology there and where the aquifers are, if there's also aquitards or aquicludes in the area, and that sort of thing. Following that up, how do you know when you should drill deeper was another question we got today. You'd only drill deeper, and I'm assuming you already have a well, if your well goes dry or when you pump it, it drops below the pump, or there's a water quality concern. You start pumping a well and all of a sudden you realize that it's pulling water from the surface and so it's not protective, then you might consider a deeper well. But again, that only works if there is a viable aquifer at a lower depth. And before you just start drilling, trying to hit a deeper aquifer, you should consult with someone either from a state agency or the USGS to understand the geology in question. They can tell you if there's other aquifers there, or a local driller who, especially a drilling company that's been around a long time in a given area. They've drilled all your neighbors' wells, everything else. They're going to know the geology there and be able to give you an idea if you're going to be able to hit water or not. Because there's nothing more frustrating for a driller than to go into a property and have to drill 3 or 4 different wells because they can't hit water. That makes them look bad. And so they're going to try to put in a well, that has an ample supply if it's possible, and they'll know if it's not. So, but some of these well construction questions, because we got several others as well that I didn't answer, are certainly better answered by the driller or contractor in your local area, or you can contact the National Groundwater Association. They represent not only drillers and contractors around the country, but scientists and engineers, a lot of the folks that make all the equipment. I'm a member and have been for a long time in the scientists and engineers division, and attend a lot of their functions, sit on some of their committees, and they have their own program for even for drillers to become a master driller, and they're trying to put the best foot forward for the industry. And you can go to their webpage and just Google them, and there's a lot of information available and people you can contact there. Related to iron and hydrogen sulfide, thoughts on Fe and H2S treatment? Dan?
I'll try to answer that. A lot of our wells around here these are really common questions. Iron typically will stay dissolved in water until it's pumped up to the surface, and then it oxidizes and falls out of solution, causes a lot of staining problems. A lot of people also have hydrogen sulfide. It's best to talk to your dealer. They'll have experience with people in your area, but various filters, usually they'll involve some type of oxidation, like a manganese oxide coating on green sand, and then they'll have a filter to filter out the residue that happens after that, like the iron that precipitates or the sulfur. So that's pretty common. There's some other techniques you could use too. For a small amount of hydrogen sulfide, you may be able to get by with the carbon filtration. Seems like I generally read that it's not as effective for higher amounts. It sort of leads into the next question, do private wells need filters? That's actually a good question. I talk to a lot of people. They don't have any filtration. They just have a pressure tank, and then they'll pump it out. They may not have a softener or any type of treatment. and if they don't have any like residue that's clogging up their screens at their taps, then they probably don't need any filters. But I always think it's a good idea to have at least a sediment filter in place. A lot of people will have some type of water treatment equipment like a softener, and a softener may cost you $1,500 to $2,000. And these, if you just have a sediment filter in front of it, it's like a $40 piece of equipment. You just change a cartridge out every few months, and it's a really cheap way to protect treatment equipment downstream. And of course, there's other, you may find other things. If you have a lot of iron, some people, you may put an iron filter in front of the softener. A lot of times softeners will just take out the iron themselves. If I've talked to some people though that will have over 10 parts per million of iron, and so they're just things that you should talk about with a local dealer.
Thanks, Dan. I was muted there. This is also for you.
Okay. Yeah, we get a lot of questions in our lab, and I think through this private well class too, about how effective is reverse osmosis. And the other question is if the water had a high reading, I think the context was about bacteria count. Will it remove that bacteria? Basically, reverse osmosis will take out about 90% of mostly everything in the water. That includes most minerals, and it'll include things that are bigger than those ions, including bacteria. Although I don't believe reverse osmosis it's not intended to be something that would remove the bacteria on a continuing basis. I would say even the minerals and stuff, they usually want you to put a softener in front of it so you don't have things that foul the membrane. I think you'll find that they say that it could be even a breeding ground for bacteria, or if there's a small flaw in the membrane, if a little bit of bacteria gets through, it could cause bacteria growth on the other side of the reverse osmosis membrane, like in the holding tank. So it's not really intended to be, my understanding is it's not intended to be used for bacteria removal, but it probably will work. But it should take about 90% of most things out. Neutrally charged species tend to be difficult. That's an issue to take up with your dealer, or not really context right here to get into all that.
And Dan, sorry about that. I misread the question because I left the bacteria part of that out. So I apologize.
No, that's all right. I think they were assuming, I thought there was some of that in the.
Yeah, it might have been. And I just, I know we've discussed before that there are two forms of arsenic, +3 and +5, and RO seems to work much better at one than the other.
Oh yeah, you know what? Yeah, I didn't, sorry, I didn't address that, and then I see you've got it in the question here. But yeah, Steve makes a good point. Arsenic, I think neutral species, depending on the pH of the water, they tend to be, I think, a little bit resistant to crossing the membrane, so they can be harder to remove. And arsenic around here, there's two different forms, and one is really easy to remove when the other isn't. So generally, we've had customers put in an oxidation like a chlorinator before the reverse osmosis, and they've had really good luck removing it when it didn't remove any at all before. So thanks for making that point, Steve.
Okay, so what's the typical percentage of bacteria-contaminated wells in Missouri, Illinois, and the Midwest? I thought this was really an intriguing question because, again, you can't look at things in that kind of perspective. The geology and the groundwater are so different, even from county to county. So, so my answer basically is, every well has a potential to be contaminated depending on construction, which is why testing is so important. And as to that said, they can happen for a number of different reasons. Poor construction, wells in pits without a well cap. We see wells that have a Folgers can on top of them, or that maybe are older and weren't grouted. So, and for shallow water source, whether it's a dug well or if it's a surface sand and it's like a sand point, those are certainly more susceptible because they're closer to the surface. And again, also, if there's a contamination source nearby. sometimes whenever a well is properly constructed, and we just had the question, the well seems secure and great, why am I having this continued bacteria problem? It could be as simple as there's a pathway down to the aquifer from a feedlot or from a septic system, and it's close enough to the well, even though it meets the setback that's 75 or 100 feet or whatever, that it's causing a preferential flow into the well. And when that's the case, there's going to be no solution other than treating the contaminant as if like it's a surface water system, and you have to have continuous disinfection. And also then vulnerable aquifers, karst geology, southern Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee especially, but there's karst in a lot of other areas where there's springs and dolomitic limestone. Those areas, anywhere where there might be sinkholes and things like that. So we have a county in Illinois where 70 to 80% of the private well samples come back positive, and it's karst. And so, but not, 2 counties away, there's a good sand and gravel aquifer, and it's buried underneath about 100 feet of clay. The number is much different. It's probably less than 5 to 10%, and those are all older wells. So there's really no way to define things like as far as this question, and it's a matter of the aquifer and all these things I've mentioned. And so it's really important if you're at a local or county health department or even at a state health department to understand all of those issues and identify them, and it gives you the best information to help a well owner whenever you run across these. And I kid you not, you run across wells that have all of these points. It's in a pit, it's in it's a sandy area or karst, and there's a farm with a feedlot there, and there's a lot of wells that in places where you wish they didn't have to have a well. Another question about well points, which if you're not familiar, a well point or a sand point is a well that's driven into the ground. I know you can buy these kits even like at a farm and fleet or a farm store where you can pound it in yourself with a sledgehammer. It's got a 4-foot screen. It's maybe 3-inch or 2-inch diameter, usually 2, I guess, and it comes all prepared. And in Illinois, they're not allowed anymore, and in a number of states they aren't, but they're really cheap water supply, and if you're in an area like near a river bottom where the water table may be really shallow, you can pound in 15 feet and you can have a water supply. So someone asked, what are the concerns related to these? Well, it should be pretty clear, but it's not properly constructed based on well code, at least our well code. There's no grout near the surface to protect it. And I think in the question the person asked, they said that their state allows them but requires 6 feet of clay material near the surface. So in that case, you're digging a hole at least 6 feet deep to start with so you can fill it in with clay. But, if you've, by pounding on that with a sledgehammer, if you've created any free space outside the casing and inside the hole, then there's going to be a pathway for stuff to slide down through. And but these are usually in very shallow environments where there's typically sand, and so they already have a high infiltration rate where surface contaminants can get into the groundwater, and again, they have no grout seal, and so there's just it's a very affordable way to get a water supply, and people do it, but it's just not very safe. So and there are drill rigs that drive well casing. That's a different animal, and they're done still installed to code in some of the in that case, and they're usually a lot deeper. But this is I'm talking more about the sandpoint type of system here. So we got a lot of questions about well maintenance and sealing. I'm just going to go over these really quick. So should a rusty cap with openings be replaced? Yeah, your well needs to be properly sealed at the surface. Otherwise, ants, mice, everything else can get in. We open up wells all the time, and there's a mouse nest in there, which means if they, there's likely a bacteria problem. There's a small screen. If you have a screen on your well cap, it needs to make sure the screen's still there. It should be sealed. In theory, your well cap has a rubber gasket, and when if there were a flooding event over your well, it would hold itself and not leak. But I would say one of the things that you hardly ever hear about is replacing that rubber gasket, and most of the time when we open up a well, that rubber gasket is just a brittle, hard thing that isn't doing its job anymore. So, but yeah, you should always have protecting your well at the surface is the big thing. And one of our recommendations is even if you take a cap off a well for any reason, you should probably disinfect your well just to be safe, or at least sample, so to make sure that you haven't created a bacteria problem. We had a question about grout slurry not mixed properly to 2 to 1 a cement grout. I recommend, I'm not an expert on this, so I recommend that you go to look up the Nebraska Grout Study, and it was by their state Department of Health and Human Services, I believe, but they worked at developing a lot of material and tried a lot of scenarios, and in a lot of states, actually when this came out, I remember the headline in one of the drilling magazines was the Nebraska Grout Study is going to cause a lot of states to change their well code, and in the end, not one state did. But the bottom line is, because a well is properly grouted, doesn't mean that it's actually still got grout all the way around the annulus and is protected, and you can't assume that it's not the annulus that's causing a water quality problem. There's just too many cases where mixed grout, liquid grout, seeps into the formation and doesn't stay in the borehole, depending on the geology of the material on the outside of the borehole. And so what they recommended actually is that you should always use natural bentonite chips, which no one recommends or is part of any state regulation, I don't believe. Because once they've saturated and expanded, they stay tight and, they stay in the formation or stay in the borehole. Should all wells have a meter to measure usage? My boss answered this question. That would be awesome. And, it's in some areas it matters more than others, is the bottom line. A lot of wells are metered out west in some cases. Probably more importantly, Oregon requires a new well to have a basometer tube, which is a small diameter tube that goes all the way down the well so that you can measure the water level in the well. That's one of the best practices we recommend in our class lessons. If you've taken our class just as a best practice, so many times whenever you have a well problem, you don't have water. Is it your pump? Is water going below the pump and causing it, to break suction? What's going on? And if you had a way to measure the water level in your well without having to take the cap off and having someone drop a tape down and all that other stuff, sometimes it can solve your problem and help you understand what's going on. And so, in my opinion anyway, is it's probably a lot more important to have a basometer tube so that you can measure the water level in your well, because it can tell you if, when you do have a well problem. It'll certainly rule out the fact that it's that there's no water in your well if all of a sudden your pump's not working. If the water level's 40 feet above your pump, you should still have water. What to do with old hand-driven wells? Any well that's not in use, especially this is hand-driven, but I'm thinking more of the old hand-dug wells, or the wells like we looked at that had the horse in it and the guy fell in and all those stuff. Those should be sealed. They should be filled up with clay and gravel and bentonite according to the code in your state, and filled in so that they're no longer an issue. And I know someone had asked, we put these seals in these old wells, are they going to hold permanently? How can we expect that to stay there forever? Well, when you're filling in the open space and then you're putting layers of material that prevent water from moving through it, like a bentonite clay or a cement, I'm not going to be around in 1,000 years or 10,000 years for sure, but those things shouldn't break down. They're natural materials, especially if you use bentonite clay. It's a natural environmental material, and it prevents water from moving through. And if it dries out, that's one reason why Nebraska suggested natural bentonite chips, because for some reason it dries out. It doesn't crack like the manufactured stuff does. And when it rehydrates, those cracks can stay. But in natural bentonite, those chips, it will reseal itself. And so water can't get through that, because as soon as the water gets there, then it expands and seals again. And so, my take is there may be materials that would crack and then not be acceptable anymore. But if you're sealing it the right way and you're using bentonite, you're likely it would be a permanent thing. There was also several questions about, can you trust your water treatment salesman? What makes a good driller? One of the things I will point out is Penn State has this document, which I've highlighted here at the bottom, called Home Water Treatment in Perspective. And it talks about some of the issues. In every industry, in every profession, there are good guys and bad guys. And that's the best way to say it. It doesn't matter what profession that is. The only way to know for sure is to do what you can do to have more assurance. And that's educate yourself, ask questions, and get references. So it's really like any other service provider, it's buyer beware. Just like when a homeowner is going to buy a home, we get calls all the time from people saying, I bought this house, we tested it for nitrate and coliform, it was fine. Now 2 years later, I'm sampling it. I sampled it for arsenic and it's 150 ppb. I want somebody's head. My well, they told me it was safe and it's not. I tell every well owner they should sample for anything that might be a risk before they buy a house, for the same reason. Because after it's done, you've already bought it. And so we do have recommendations in our class lessons related to drillers. And then again, there's this paper here on water treatment. There's a lot of best practices relating to hiring a driller. They should be educated. They should be a member of their state association probably. Usually a driller that's been around a long time means that they've got the longevity. They can give you references. They're bonded, all those things. I'm fairly sure that NGWA, the National Groundwater Association, has a thing with a list, which I did not have a chance to look up beforehand. I apologize. But there are good drillers and bad drillers just the same. We've done studies here in Illinois where every well log is on file for a given area, and the driller's really done a good job at filling that out. And there's others where I go to 5 houses in a row and I'm like, Mr. Smith drilled my well just 5 years ago, and yet there's no log on file because they're breaking the law and they choose not to file it. It saves their customer $100. And so you just need to weed those out. And the way to do that is, and especially a lot of you at health departments, if you're working with new wells that are installed or doing any work related to that, you understand who your drillers are and which ones, just over time you learn those things too. So, but this is a really good paper, and we link to it in our lesson 10. It just talks about some of the misconceptions. There's also one thing I didn't put on here. New Hampshire has a website. It's called Be Well Informed, and it's a tool that you can use to put in a sample analysis, and it tells you what kind of treatment would be relevant for that type of constituent. So if you put in arsenic is over 10 ppb, it'll give you a red flag and say your arsenic's over the Safe Drinking Water Act standard of 10 for a community water supply. You can treat that one of two ways. You can either use these filters or you can use RO. And so if someone tries to sell you, tries to sell a well owner some other equipment like an alkalinity thing, that's the big rage it seems like these days, to raise your alkalinity, that they're just trying to sell you something. And so it's about understanding what the issues are. So that's what I have. Don't leave. We do have a number of questions, which I will pull over here from Katie's been tracking. So let me make this full screen. And we've only got 15 minutes here. We're running long, I know. And can everybody see that? I'm going to assume you can. There we go. I'm going to move this over here, make this bigger. Okay, so at the local health department, we're having slight pushback from people to get them to seal their well. What's the best way to get someone to seal abandoned well? If you don't have a stick instead of a carrot, you're going to have a hard time in a lot of cases because there's no advantage to the well owner. If they know the well's there, it's going to cost them money. In some states, the Soil Water Conservation District has a program where they will cost share that. And I know like in Iowa, they have a Grants to Counties program. And a lot of the counties use it for sampling. They're helping out with sampling, but some also use it for helping cost share abandoned well, getting rid of abandoned wells, which is awesome. Every state should have that. So, yeah, I don't have a good answer other than to recommend to people that if anyone were to fall in their abandoned well, they would probably lose their property because they'd be sued. It's a safety risk. They could be contaminating an aquifer, all those things. But if you don't have any legal recourse, you know, that's a tough one. And I don't have a better answer. Yeah, it says our state grandfathers in old wells too. Everyone does that. Yes. But this is an understanding. There's no rule or law supporting this. Yeah, so the problem is well construction code is for new wells. So any well that already exists doesn't have to meet that standard. It's for the drillers to use when they're installing a new well. And that's why maybe there isn't a law that specifically says they're grandfathered in, but there are no laws that say old wells have to be converted to meet code. So, and it is accurate nationwide. Now, I met someone from a local health department in Massachusetts who says that she actually has the ability to condemn wells and has condemned 2. And that's why earlier today I said in 99% of the country, health departments can't tell you can't drink your water. Well, there's a few places where they can, and that's just because they pass their own local ordinances. It's not very common, but, you know, I would tell a well owner to be sure they know where they're coming from. In Illinois, they can't. So, yeah. So should chlorine tabs be in wells? If not, where? I have a galvanized tank. Well, so a number of states have made those illegal. The little, looks like the orange McDonald's tub that drops a tablet into the well every so often for chlorine. And instead, you know, you should go with a regular chlorinator that's like a treatment device in your basement type of thing. They're not consistent. They don't really, if there's bacterial growth on a pipe or somewhere in the line, it doesn't provide a consistent amount of chlorine to actually kill it. So that's why when you shock chlorinate a well, you mix the amount of chlorine, put it in the well based on the amount of water in your well and the amount of line you have. And then once that's all mixed, you run it through every faucet in your house and every toilet, everything, and you let it sit overnight so that the chlorine can actually kill the bacteria. And the chlorine tabs just are not going to do that because you're not running water through all your lines at the same time. You're not making sure there's chlorine throughout the lines. They just don't do a good job. Yeah. Do you have any idea what kind of overall disease burden is from folks unknowingly drinking from contaminated or sanitary water sources wells? You know, unfortunately, the way the system's set up, you know, it takes an outbreak of some sort. And there have been a few people who've done research studies like through CDC and stuff to look at how many cases of, you know, just some kind of stomach disease or whatever. And I'm not a health professional, obviously, but it's really unknown, you know, and even if a whole family gets sick, to understand whether it's actually from their well water or from something they ate. My understanding is it can take several days sometimes for those symptoms to present themselves. And so to track that back, even for folks that know how to do that, can be a really difficult thing to do. So, yeah, I'm sure there are some of the state health department or the CDC folks probably could give a better answer to that than I can. So how prevalent is radon in water and what labs are available to test for it, and how do you sample for it? If you would send me an email, because we don't sample for radon and it's not something that I'm familiar with dealing with, but my boss has, and he gave me a list of, I don't remember if it was a list of labs or just a sample procedure for how to collect it, or labs that will give you the sample procedure to do that, and I can probably get that. It was last year sometime, and I can find that and send it to you, because I don't know how to answer that off the top of my head. But if you'll email us, we will send that to you. Any good studies on crop fumigants and their travel through groundwater via irrigation canals? We did a lot of work back in the 90s looking at non-point source pollution and some of those things, but a lot of that type of research is more fundamental and not applied. And so we have not, I don't have any information on it. You really need to go to the literature to see if there's anything there on that particular issue. So because, it's not something we deal with. It's, it's like one of the things that's frustrating for me as someone who works with well owners every day is there's some folks who are talking about, pharmaceuticals and things that we can detect now down to the trillionth. Those aren't the typical well problem. There may be someone who has that issue or a few people that have that issue, but we have so many more people who have wells that aren't sealed properly or old construction or who aren't managing the well the way they should be. We have to get past the millions of people that need to have that education before we really worry about some of these other issues. And I understand, I grew up on a farm, but I don't have, we haven't dealt with some of those specifics. Like PFOA and PFOS is the hot one right now. And certainly those are issues in some areas, either where there's an air base or some of the other things. But it's localized in a way, and this is a national program, and so we've tried to stick with things that are much more, Anyway, that's my answer. Do you have a link to where we can download the Nebraska Drought Study? It's a series of web pages, and if you Google Nebraska Drought Study, it should come right up, and maybe add DHHS, I think. I can probably find that. Actually, if you go to our web page, which I think that's the last question, if you go to the private well class, and I'll go to our private well conference, these are all the presentations, and one of them is by Tom Christofferson, How Grout or Lack of Grout Affects Water Quality. We asked Tom to come out and talk about the grout study because, again, because no one had, what did I do here? Yeah. Because no one really changed their state rules related to that, we realized,
well, I want to thank Steve
I'm going to stop that there. We realized that a lot of people didn't realize the grout study was even done. And there's a lot of information there, and you can contact Tom directly, and he can probably give you a lot better information than I can. But again, he's a very helpful guy, and the work they did was really valuable, and it's something we should all understand. So, I would recommend that you reach out to him. Okay. Well, we've gone really long. I apologize for that. Katie or Dan, anything else that you want to share?
No, I don't think I have anything.
All right. Well,
one thing I thought about.
Go ahead.
Oh, not a huge deal, but the EDB question, I thought you covered it great. It just made me think as a chemist that just to make people aware that some of those things, I'm assuming that stands for ethylene dibromide. If you're looking for information about some of those things that are organic in nature, they go by a lot of different names. So do a little bit of research. You'll probably find this under regulated 1,2-dibromo ethane. I believe it's a regulated component, and if it's regulated, you might be able to find more information, not necessarily about how it travels through groundwater and irrigation, but health effects and maybe some generic sources at the, if you just search for national drinking water standards, the EPA has a good site with some extra links on some of that kind of stuff. But just the big thing is that there's a lot of different names for some of these organic things, so just do a little bit of research. You should be able to figure it out.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks for attending. Again, if you have any questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. And if you email your attendance stuff, Katie will get that and get back to you. So thanks again, and have a great day.